Donald Trump himself has come out recently with some very, let's say, bold strategies on how to help the consumer. First and foremost, I'm sure you all have heard, he wants to ban corporations from buying homes. He wants to get interest rates down. Why is that? It's because people can't afford to buy homes, even though in 51% of the country, according to Zillow, we've seen price cuts over the last year. So the point here is, if the economy was booming and the poor middle class and the high end was all doing fantastically well, as you would imagine looking at just the GDP numbers, would Trump need to go to these extremes prior to midterms? And we're not done with the housing market. Let's go over to his more recent talking point, and this is trying to cap interest rates for credit card transactions. Well, who's using credit cards? Well, that would be the poor and the middle class, the people that are likely getting squeezed if you believe the labor market data. So you see what we're saying here. If you look at the metals like copper, well, that definitely backs up the GDP story. But if you look at things like what Trump is actually doing, that backs up the labor market story. But now let's move on to corporate America, where Macy's has recently come out and talked about their bold new strategy where they're trying to target the higher end consumer. And if we look at like Delta Airlines, where they're making all their money is at the high end, selling first class tickets. So what this shows you is maybe the top 1% are doing well, but the bottom, let's just say 90%, they're really struggling. So now that we've looked at a lot of different data points, let's try to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and come to some conclusions about what's really happening with the United States economy. Step number 3, now let's try to reconcile all of these data points and try to make sense of actually what is going on, the reality of the situation, and not just the narrative that you hear in the mainstream media. So we're going to start with, well, my opinion, that it's all about this. In fact, it's all about these 3 things in my view. We're going to start with the K-shaped economy. Now, most of you know what this is, but I think it's great to get a visual representation to show just how powerful this actually is. So we go from today's date all the way back to 2009. And here we go from 0 up to 6,000, actually a little bit higher here, and down to a negative 1,500. And, oh shoot, I forgot. On the right, we had some numbers that are applicable to this blue line. Editor, go ahead and throw those up on the screen, or the actual original chart. So first, let's pay attention to this blue line. This is a visual representation of the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey. And again, that's applicable to the numbers on the right, which I forgot to include. But really, it's all about the trend. So we see this going up kind of in lockstep with this red line until we get to the cerveza sickness. And then you see they go the complete opposite directions. Now, what is this red line? This red line is a smoothed out representation of, you guessed it, the S&P 500. So once we get past the cerveza sickness, consumer sentiment really plunges. In fact, lower than it was even at the depths of the GFC, but yet the stock market goes higher and higher. It doesn't go higher and higher and higher. It goes absolutely parabolic. So if you own assets during this period, or the S&P 500 using as a proxy, well, you're like Scrooge McDuck. You're swimming around in all your gold coins. Your purchasing power has increased massively. You're out there buying bottle service. You're out there going out to eat every single night. You're buying a new car. You're going on vacations. You're flying first class, etc. Which would make sense when we look at step number 2 and see what's happening at Macy's, trying to target the high-end consumer, and the airlines saying that they're making all their profit with those first class seats. But I don't think it ends just with the K-shaped economy. Let's think about what's happening right now with AI CapEx. So the capital expenditures, we all have heard the stories, and you've probably seen them in your backyard, of these data centers going up. They're going up like wildfire. Now, we can debate as to whether or not this is a bubble, but the bottom line is they're spending trillions of dollars on this build out for AI. That requires a lot of copper. So even if the overall economy is slowing with the exception of that one thin slice, you would not only see this picked up in nominal GDP or even real GDP, but you would also expect to see these copper prices ripping higher. But it doesn't end there. Now let's go over to this third point that I'd like to make. And I think this is key because I don't hear anybody talking about this. And I think it's a really big deal. So make sure you pay attention to this one. It's something I call the price rotation. Now, what is this? You guys all know that we have had tariffs, and I'm not going to debate whether that's good or bad. But we do know that imports into the United States have been decreasing. Okay, well, if imports are decreasing, that most likely means cheaper goods from outside of the United States. So, is it great that everyone's buying America or buying more American products? Sure. Well, it all depends on who you are. Because if you're the poor or middle class, if you're in the lower, let's say 90%, well, then what you have is a substitution. So before you were able to buy this widget A, let's say, for $1. But now that's not being imported into the United States. So your only option is to buy from a U.S. manufacturer. Now, again, that may be good, but the bottom line is you're only going to have an option if you want that widget. You're only going to have a $2 option as opposed to a $1 option and a $2 option. And if you think about the deflator for real GDP, remember they start with nominal GDP and then try to calculate or take out the inflation rate, and that's what gives you the real GDP or inflation adjusted number. So if that deflator is wrong, then you got a big problem, don't you? So if we just looked at this, widget B has not gone up in price. No, the deflator would be zero. But if you include the substitution, then this means that the out-of-pocket cost for the consumer is going to actually double, which would put far more pressure on their purchasing power, which is what we're seeing in the University of Michigan survey. Now, what's really interesting is if you think through the percentage of income that the rich people with assets, let's say the top 10%, spend on this substitution. Now, they only have the option of B as well, because no one has the option of A. But this is such a minute percentage of their overall income or net worth that they really don't even feel it. Because sure, they have to pay an extra $1 for this widget, but they just made an extra $1,000 because the S&P 500 went up by 5%. So the bottom line is if we start with 5% nominal GDP and we add their deflator, and these aren't exact numbers, just using it for the sake of the example. Let's just say it's 1%. That's what takes us down to the 4% real GDP. But if you look at it in terms of the price rotation, we shouldn't be subtracting 1%. We should probably be subtracting more like 5 or 6% if we're really trying to measure the impact on the average Joe and Jane, which would take the real GDP from 4% down to, let's just say, 0%. So when you scratch beneath the surface, you look at the K-shaped economy, you look at what the AI CapEx spend is doing to not only real GDP growth, but also some of those metals like copper that have gone straight up. When you look at the labor market, it's that head scratcher. And then you combine that with this price rotation that has put an even further pressure on the bottom 90%, where the top 10% don't even feel it. And then you calculate that into real GDP, it makes a lot more sense. So to answer the question, are we seeing Trump's economic boom or an economic bust? I would say both. It all depends on who you are.